Today we're going to learn how to connect Next.js with Apollo. Welcome to DevWorld, my name is Sam. Today we're going to have a look at how to connect Apollo, so GraphQL, with Next.js with all of the fetching methods, so server-side rendered and static site generation. So what is Apollo? Apollo is a library that helps you connect to GraphQL. And of course, Next.js is a framework on top of React. And here we have our Create Next app with a folder called library, then the pages folder, and here we have everything regarding the queries. And of course, here we have the pages. Here in our package.json, I have installed Apollo client, GQL, so the GraphQL query language, then GraphQL itself. And of course, this comes with Create Next app. So first of all, let's go here and check out what Apollo client is. So this is where we initialize pretty much, or where we create our Apollo client. One thing that is different, for example, if you want to do it just with React, that you don't have to have this SSR mode, so server-side render mode. And here we take in our URL. So this is just a normal URL to my GraphQL endpoint of my API. And of course here, for example, I use Hasura. So here we use the API key for Hasura. So here is where you would set the different properties like headers or anything else you want to have in your query. And that's already pretty much it. The next thing is Apollo.js, and both Apollo client and Apollo.js, this comes pretty much just from the documentation of Apollo itself. So this is where we initialize Apollo. I don't want to go into too much detail what happens here, but we will just create the state that we get from the query, and then we will use memo from React to memoize the query. But again, this comes just from the documentation of Apollo and Next.js. And of course, the source code to this repo is in the description down below if you just want to copy paste it. Then here in queries, we have the query. And you can see this is just a normal GraphQL query. And I like to structure them in a queries folder by itself. So we have the query, we have the instance of Apollo, and then the Apollo client, which creates the instance. And we call that in our _app.js, where we wrap our component in our Apollo provider. And then the initialized Apollo client comes from our custom use Apollo hook, which we generated here in Apollo.js. So this is the hook we created, which we're gonna call here. And then let's go to the interesting part. Let's go to our index.js file. This is a very basic file where we're just gonna return an h1 with home and then the h2 with some kind of data from our API. Here we use the fetch method get static props, and up here we just have the different checks. If it's loading, if there's an error, or if there is an empty array, we will return error loading, or here product not found. Data error and loading comes from the use query, which is a hook from Apollo client. And this is a little bit special. So here we use in the function component here, we use the hook use query, whereas down here in the fetch method get static props, we call Apollo client and the method query, because of course we can't use a hook outside of a functional component. So that's why Apollo client has this method query, which is exactly the same thing. So we have a query, which is our query get product by ID, and then we can also attach the variables, which in our example is code. So this is the variable in our query. So this one here, which is our variable, and the variable is set up here. So this is a product code we have, and here we do the exact same thing. Just we have get product by ID as the first parameter, and here the variables is just the second parameter. It's just very important that the query you have and whatever variables you have in here or any other things you want to attach, that this is exactly the same thing as you do down here. So this in query and the use query hook have to use the same kind of data. Why we'll check out in a bit. So let's see how the app looks like at the moment. So at the moment is home, and this is absolutely amazing. That's what we return here in our h2. So let's check out if that is actually server-side rendered. So with get static props, so we can go here and we see their source code, and we can see it actually is pre-rendered. If it would be client-side rendered and not server-side rendered like it is right now, we would not see our HTML in here. It would just be an empty div. So let's check that out. Let's go here and comment that out. And if you go back here and refresh our page, we can see there is no HTML rendered. Of course, there's just the h1 with loading, which we set here. But the actual data, this is absolutely amazing, is not rendered on a page. This is client-side injected afterwards. So we can also change that to get static props to get server side props, which is the other fetching method by Next. So let's save that, go to our page, refresh. And we can see it's also server-side rendered. So now with the server-side rendering and not with the static page. So that's great. It's very, very flexible what we can do here. We can just change the name here to change our fetch method from get server-side props to get static props. But what actually happens here, so here we initialize Apollo, then we have the Apollo client. Here we attach the query method, and then the cached state of our query, we will put that in as props here. And those props again are used here as the initial Apollo state, which then will be served to the Apollo provider. And then in our page again, here from our Apollo provider, we can use this hook to get the state. So that's pretty much it. And conveniently, this useQuery hook returns data, error, and loading. Then this is important. Loading should only work if it's client-side rendered. So if we don't have anything here. Otherwise, loading should not appear in your application. If it appears anyway, you know there is something wrong and the data is client-side rendered instead of server-side rendered. And then that's pretty much it. That's how we are able to fetch our GraphQL from our API. So what happens if you have a different query here, for example, than we have here? So let's change that to a product that doesn't exist. If you reload, we can see here the product is just not found. But if you reverse that, and if we put something else down here, go back to our page and refresh, we can see the data is still returned, but we can see with the loading state that it's actually now client-side rendered. So that's why it's important to have whatever you have here also up here. Otherwise you either get an error, or even worse, you get the data, but you don't realize that it's client-side rendered. And what we now can check out is dynamic routing. So I have the product ID.js here, which is pretty much the same component. So we have the different loading and error states, and we return the H2 from our API. And here we have get server-side props. But what we will do is we have our query, which comes in here as a parameter. This is how we can access what actually is in the route up here. So let's say slash and our product code. And we get the same thing back because now it's the query.product ID is cbras, so our product code. We take that in here as the query ID. And what we also do is we pass that to the props. So the query ID, we will pass that in to the props, which then will be returned up here as a parameter, query ID. And then we will call that in our hook that again, we have the same query ID. So the same value here, then we have here in our Apollo client query method. So that's how we can make sure that the same value is put in here as it's put in here in our use query hook. So what happens if we go to a route that doesn't exist? We will get our 404 not found back, which is this component. Of course, in a real application, we would attach an error page here. And that's how we have dynamic routing with Apollo and Next.js. So let's go to another component that exists, just that we see that it will work. So XPBK is another product code, and you can see this is more than just amazing. So that's the value from our product XPBK and not cbras anymore. So if you go to cbras, we get a different value. And again, this is all client-side rendered, in our case with the method get server-side props. If you want to change that to get static props to have it as a static page, let's save that. And of course, we should get an error because we need to get static paths as well. But that's pretty easily to implement. I'll link something in the description down below and if you're interested to seeing that. But that was pretty much it for this tutorial, how to connect Apollo with Next.js. Again, the link to the repo is in the description down below. I hope this video helped. If it did, please leave it a like. And if you want to see more videos like that, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.